work. That's the only reason I logged in this manner, so I could track this meeting.
Okay, thank you.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
I believe we are live. Good morning and welcome to the first meeting of the Joint Subcommittee on Program Open Space and Agricultural Land Preservation. I am Sarah Elfrith, the Senator from District 30 and the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee, joined by my co-chair, Delegate Robin Lewis. We are here today to welcome the Joint Committee members, and it's our first Joint Committee meeting of this term. So we have some new members and some new content issues, and of course, a new administration with a new approach to the programs we're discussing today. So I'd first like to welcome my fellow senators and thank them for their time in the interim. Senator Cheryl Kagan, Senator Ben Brooks, Senator Jason Gallion, and Senator Mike McKay. Thank you for being here. I'm going to run through the agenda, and then Delegate Lewis is going to share a few words, and then we'll jump right in. But the agenda should be up online. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to screen share it as well, so everybody can know what we're talking about today. So first, we're going to have a presentation by the agencies responsible for implementing these programs to give a background on Program Open Space, Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Program, or MALP, and allied programs. We're going to run through some recently passed in the last few years legislation that impacts the programs. We're going to talk about overall demand on these programs, some budgeting issues, because of course they can only be as successful as they are funded. And then we've also asked in the pre-meetings, Chair Lewis and I have had with the secretaries, we've also asked them to kind of give us their take, this administration's take, and what they anticipate of our emerging issues over the next few years. So from the departments, we have Secretary Kevin Addix with us, Hans Schmidt, Assistant Secretary for Resource Conservation, Michelle Cable, Executive Director of the MALP program. From the Department of Natural Resources, we have Secretary Josh Kurtz and Hillary Bell, who's the Director of Land Acquisition and Planning. And lastly, and I want to thank them for being here at the last minute, we're all getting our sea legs under us with the new term. From the Department of Planning, we have Jason Dubow, who's manager of the Resource Conservation and Management Unit. Then we're going to break for a discussion, and then we'll talk about next steps, which includes our next meeting in November. Chair Lewis and I, in our pre-meetings, had envisioned this really being a reintroduction for these programs to the members. And again, because we have a new administration and a new policy perspective, ask the secretaries to share with us their plans for these programs over the next 3.5 years. And then in our November meeting, we can really kind of get into the weeds of the members of the Joint Committee, if you have ideas for legislation that would impact these programs, or other emerging issues like budget issues and things like that. So with that, Delegate Lewis, would you like to add anything?
I would. Thank you so much, Senator Elfreth. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here and serve as co-chair of this joint subcommittee. I'm Delegate Robin Lewis. I represent District 46, located in Baltimore City. And I'm honored to also welcome my fellow House members, Delegate Ann Healy and Delegate Terry Baker. So I look forward to diving into the agenda. Thank you to all of the secretaries and staff, and I look forward to getting started. So let's get started.
Wonderful. So I've been instructed that we are handing this over to the departments for the next hour or so to walk us through the programs and your vision for the future. And I believe that starts with the Department of Agriculture.
Senator, Delegate, and all senators and delegates and staff, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm Kevin Addix, Secretary of Agriculture here in Maryland, and I have the pleasure of introducing some of our team members, but specifically to talk about open space, how that relates to our programs in agriculture, and more specifically, how it connects to the governor's top priorities. Just a programming note, things are operating differently in our department. We are actively engaging with the legislature, with policymakers, with county and local policymakers as well, because we see our role in this administration, but specifically in Department of Agriculture, as facilitating rural Maryland to make sure that we are doing everything we can to be competitive, to create jobs, to preserve land, and extremely importantly in all of our contexts, to support the Bay, clean the Bay, protect the Bay. So just briefly about Department of Agriculture and our goals and how they link in with the governor's top priorities and the administration's top priorities. If you think about agriculture, and I've learned being out speaking often with groups and in the community, agriculture is almost a jargon word. People don't know what agriculture means, but when you talk about farming, they have a concept of it, but unless they're a farmer, and we are very disconnected as a population, as a community from farming, you don't necessarily know what farming is. When you talk about food, well, now people get it. Now people understand that agriculture is the growing of food. It is the feeding of people. And when you start connecting that to the administration's top priorities of ending childhood poverty, Maryland agriculture has a big role in that. We talk about healthcare. If you can gain access to fresh local food to populations in need, food is healthcare. It's not all of healthcare, but if people are eating better, they're going to feel better, and they'll have more energy and more excitement about life, et cetera. Economic competitiveness, when you look at Maryland, a majority of Maryland is rural into suburban. And so if we can make sure that in these rural areas, our populations have jobs, our farmers have the ability to create businesses, all while preserving land and doing good by the Bay, that's all the better. Making Maryland the greenest state, we're on track for that. You'll hear from our team members about what agriculture is doing to be part of that. Farmers are the original conservationists and the original environmentalists, and they will tell you that. It's one of the first things they'll say when you ask them, what are you about? What's your ethos? Creating better, healthy soil. That is not just great for growing food and not just great for saving the Bay, but it's sequestering carbon. It is sinking and capturing the water from rain, the heavier rains that we're receiving. And so when you go down the list of the governor's priorities, agriculture plays a central role in all of that. I would love at this point to introduce Michelle Cable from our Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation to walk through the benefits of that program. And I will say the connection to that is Marylanders and neighbors will very often look at agriculture as open space. But when we think about open space, we think about productive agriculture that is preserved. If it's not productive, if it's not profitable, farming won't exist in Maryland. And so that's where we begin to fuse a lot of the priorities with preserving this land, but also making sure that the folks who are preserving it, the farmers who are owning it, the next generation who's coming in has opportunities to make a living off of that land, as has been done for centuries, thereby preserving it from development. So with that, Madam Co-Chairs, I will turn it over to Michelle Cable.
Thank you, Secretary Addix. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity today. Andrew, will you share the slide presentation, please? Or if you're sharing it, or whomever. And I will say that as our three agencies put our presentations together, a lot of the topics that we were asked to discuss are built into the presentation. So it's not just the overview and then we get to it. So there's going to be kind of blended together there. So go ahead, go to the next slide, please. So we are the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation, MALF. We were funded through, I think we actually skipped a slide. Yeah, there we go. So we were created back in 1977 by the Maryland General Assembly, one of the very first purchased easement programs in the country. So that's something that we're very proud of. Maryland was very forward thinking in that. So more than 45 years old now. And in that time, we have protected over 355,000 acres of land through a total public investment, which is the majority state, then county, then federal, over $906 million. So we're actually creeping up to that $1 billion mark for just the mouth program alone, which is incredibly impressive and exciting accomplishment. Next slide, please. And we were able to do this through the foresight of Maryland to have a dedicated funding source. And DNR will go into this later, but we are, in 1969, the program open space funding was established. And we were the first state in the country again to establish this dedicated funding source with a real estate transfer tax. MALF received 17.05% of that fund to go toward our easement acquisition program. I don't ever forget the 05, that gives us a lot more money too. So it's not just 17%. Next slide, please. And so if you look at that over the last 45 years and then zoom in for the last 5 years, there has still been a tremendous amount of interest and requests from landowners, from farmers all over the state. Over the last 5 years, as a snapshot, we've been fully funded over the last 5 years. The previous 10 years, we were not fully funded, and we had, for every 2 fiscal years, we had 1 year for application because of the level of funding. Since FY19, we went back to a single year application. We have received 964 applications and have only been able to protect a little over a third of that, 352 in that same time period. So this demonstrates a continued very strong interest in the program. And we are limited by the budget, being able to protect the land that the landowners are wanting to do. Fortunately, most of the applicants that do not get offer contracts, do not sell the easement to mouth, will typically reapply. So we have a chance over and over again. Some people apply 10 years in a row, depending on if they're able to, until they finally do get that offer from us. So that's also good news, the tenacity of our farmers. Next slide, please. Just a bar chart of those numbers basically show you the difference between the number of applicants versus the number of easements we were able to settle each year. Depending on our funding, our mouth board establishes how many applications can be submitted any given cycle. So we do have a cap on what counties can submit to us. I know that there are more interested in many counties than they are able to submit to us. So while we still have a cap, there's even more interest out there than are able to provide applications to us. Next slide, please. And this is a chart, a pie chart of where those protected acres are, where the money has broken down, or that 355,000 acres, that $906 million. You'll see the largest chunk is on the Eastern Shore. Then you have Central Maryland, Southern Maryland, and Western Maryland. So the Eastern Shore and Central Maryland really are the main users of these programs, but all 23 counties are participants in this program and continue to do so. And if you go to the next slide, actually this next 2 series of slides, it shows a graphic of the map of, so this is 20 years ago and back in 2000. The green shapes are mouth, and now currently in 2023, you can see how that has evolved from 2020 to 2023. And the gray area shaded in the background are all the other protected lands, both fee simple land easements, state, county, federal. So it shows how it has all the various land preservation programs really have grown in a patchwork of opportunities to create these large blocks of protected land and these large areas of these rural agricultural spaces where there can continue to be successful agricultural operations, and having this land preserved forever gives them the security that will continue. Next slide, please. And so continuing forever. So one of the biggest challenge of easements in general, and certainly what we consider a working lands easement, which is what the agricultural easements are, is the creation of an establishment of a perpetual easement. That's a document that gets recorded in an ever-changing industry. So how do you create these easements, this program that protects the agricultural land, but also provides the ability to be flexible as the industry evolves? Here you just have some examples going back a little bit before the program started, that nice black and white photo on the bottom. But you have grain operations, row crops, equestrian, hoop houses, produce, wineries, vineyards. So there's a vast variety of agricultural operations and opportunities in Maryland. And how do we have easements that are able to evolve in that? And our best solution is to allow to not have a specific limitation of what agriculture is in the definition of our easements that are recorded, but just have a general accepted agricultural practices. And as those practices change through time and through history, since that is the consideration or the general acceptance of this is a standard agricultural use, that's also allowed to evolve. One of the best examples in here, you see the pictures of the horses at the bottom. When the MALF program was established, horses were considered commercial, not agriculture. They were not eligible for applying for a MALF easement. Now, horses are written in one of the examples of what agriculture is. So it changes. Next slide. These are also pictures of how things are changing. So you have more than just commodities and selling for the large grains operations and things like that. More and more farmers in Maryland and our MALF easement farmers are finding opportunities to provide value and selling directly to the customers to be able to get to continue their operation and to grow it and to have more financial opportunities and success. These are just a handful of photos of opportunities that are allowed on MALF easements. We have dairy operations that have ice cream, sell directly to farm. A number of farms on the Maryland Ice Cream Trail are protected under the MALF easements. You have corn mazes, you have breweries, you have the farm festivals, agritourism operations, direct sales. So all of these opportunities are showing how agriculture is evolving, both for the state and through our easement program, that we allow them to continue to do this, to have opportunities for commercial success and not just having to have traditional, cows and crops type of agriculture. Next slide, please. And I'll kind of weave down to MALF and turn it over here to Hans in a moment, but bringing in, as we were saying, Secretary was saying before, of the Chesapeake Bay goals, the Chesapeake Bay agreements, how our MALF easements help contribute to those goals are through what is standard voluntary measures on non-easement properties to have soil and water conservation plans, forest management plans. When you enter into a MALF easement program, into the MALF easement, it's a requirement to have these plans. So these plans work with the soil conservation districts to establish best management practice for that farm with that farmer's goal in combination to have both the success on the farm and the success for the land, for the soils, for the nutrients. In addition, Maryland has a nutrient management plan requirement that is a law. And while most farmers follow that law, there are some that are a little delayed. We have worked with our nutrient management section here at Department of Agriculture, so we will not settle an easement until we ensure that those plans are in place and implemented. And so, Hans, if you want to kind of go a little bit further into our Bay Agreement and conservation goals, we can do that, if that works for you.
That works for me. Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. So the Office of Resource Conservation works with farmers to address any resource concerns that they have on their farms. And as Michelle said, one of the priorities for the MALF, or the requirements through MALF, is that farmers have a soil and water conservation plan. They also have a current, and as well as in compliance with nutrient management. We have staff throughout the soil conservation districts across the state. Those are the frontline folks that farmers go into those offices. They meet with staff and sit down and talk about what their needs are. As Michelle said, farms are evolving all the time, changes are happening. And so as things are changing, as we're experiencing more climate change and so forth, we're looking at how we can expand on our programs to help assist those farmers for making sure that they're still growing affordable, healthy foods for one of the largest metropolitan areas anywhere in the country, but also that we're also meeting our Chesapeake Bay goals. as I said, our soil conservation folks administer our state programs, but our districts are also very unique in Maryland, where we have state, federal, and local employees working with farmers, bringing resources to those counties, to those districts that are unique for those districts and counties to help meet their targeted initiatives or target needs there. We have a WIP plan that has been approved by EPA. We have our planners who go out, visit with the farmers, walk those farms, develop a soil and water conservation plan, and sit down with those farmers to help address whatever needs they are, and then to talk about what programs we have. Maryland has has the gold standard cover crop program, best cover crop program anywhere in the country. We have the MAX program, which offers cost share to put capital projects on the ground. Maryland has developed a conservation buffer initiative that's very similar to the federal CREP program that gives farmers and landowners more flexibility with buffers and managing those buffers. That we listened to farmers and landowners when we developed the WIP 3 plan, and we took their suggestions and developed this buffer initiative. Michelle mentioned the horse operations and horses. I think Maryland has more horses per square mile than any state in the country. So we've developed a horse outreach work group that works directly with horse owners to direct any resource concerns that they have on their farms. Again, we have 3 priorities really: is Chesapeake Bay restoration, climate resiliency, and environmental justice. And we just hired a coordinator for equity and climate initiatives that'll be working with all our programs, both within resource and MALF and other programs, and making sure that our programs are accessible to all farms, all landowners within the state. We just developed a small urban farm program to work and provide cost share and technical assistance for farmers in those urban areas that live and work in the food deserts per se, and making sure that they have all access to even our large production farms. So I'll turn it back over to you, Michelle.
Great, thanks so much. So if you could jump to the next slide. And so kind of following up on some of that and what we've talked about with the chairs prior to this, asking about those historically underserved communities. And per the defined term by the USDA, there are 4 groups in the historically underserved communities: beginning farmers that have less than 10 years experience, socially disadvantaged, veterans, and limited financial resources. Per the definition of the USDA, gender is not listed in one of those categories. Next slide, please. And as Hans had mentioned, we did recently hire a coordinator for equity and climate initiatives. And for MALF, how we strive to reach out to these communities through representation of having a diverse group that serve on the MALF Board of Trustees. The counties are the ones that do the direct outreach to the farmers. And so I know they all strive to have outreach to the farmers equally around their areas. And then how the properties get ranked, there is an approved ranking system for ranking these farms in the order of how we do easement offers, which primarily focus on the objective qualities of those farms, size, soils, etc. But there are opportunities to have specific initiatives or categories to build into them, and that's something that we can look into the future. And while we have not captured different demographics in our history of the MALF offers, we did reach out to Marbidco, and they did provide a report on the loans and grants programs that they have served. And while there's no preference given to different categories, they have shown that their grants and loans have benefited the racial minorities and women through the years that they've been tracking this. So that is a good indication that we've also started talking to them about that. Next slide, which I think is the last slide. Kevin, I wasn't sure if you wanted to touch base on this and you kind of did a little in the beginning, or if you wanted me to do this.
I can just add 30 seconds, Michelle, and thank you for that. And Hans, thanks for the lead up as well. Maryland is unique in so many ways. We already mentioned the Chesapeake Bay. We are all farming in the context of the Bay. But when you think about the markets that we have locally, the fact that every farmer in Maryland is within 2 hours of 2 to 3 major metropolitan markets, and that's everything, obviously Baltimore and DC, but in Western Maryland, that's Pittsburgh. In Southern Maryland, that's Richmond. In Cecil, Baltimore County, that's Wilmington, up into Philadelphia. Our farmers have access to direct markets, people who are willing to spend a lot of money on local agriculture. And that's truly unique. And so if we can bring back meat processing, seafood processing, canning, cold storage, we are able to meet markets directly that other states have to ship out of state or out of country to reach. So when we're thinking about land preservation, we're thinking about what is it that we can do in our market that's different, that allows our farmers to be self-sustainable. Profitable is not a bad word when we're talking about a business that is sustaining, maintaining land and working toward the Bay, keeping land out of development.
And that is our slide. So I don't know whether you wanted to have questions, opportunities for MDA, if you wanted to go through all of the agencies and have questions at the end.
Thank you, Michelle and Department of Ag. I think maybe if we like burning technical questions about what we just heard, let's do those now. But if we have kind of discussion questions about maybe what we didn't hear, let's save this for the end. But I see 2 hands, 1 senator, 1 delegate, but Delegate Lewis, I saw the delegate's hand first.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for the presentation, Secretary Addix, Ms. Cable, Mr. Schmidt, Assistant Secretary Schmidt. I always learn something when I talk with you guys. I do see that we have a delegate's hand up, so with your permission, Senator, I'll call on Delegate Ann Hewley with a specific technical question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair, both Madam Chairs. And I want to thank the Secretary for the presentation. This is about the MALF program, and the technical questions have to do with what I noticed in the maps is that there's almost nothing in Prince George's County. And I know that the southern half of the county is largely agricultural. And I know also that there are issues perhaps with the soil quality and the horses, that which is a big part of the agriculture in southern Prince George's County. So my question is, the changes about the horses, is there an outreach to the horse farms to participate? That's my first question.
So the horse industry, MALF has been at multiple horse-related groups in the past. That was a change that probably happened 20-ish or more years ago. So it's been quite a long time since the horse industry has been eligible into the MALF program. It might have even been longer, before 2000. We have a number of them. We are not doing currently any outreach to the horse industry, but it's something that we could certainly pursue. And the other half of your question, when you reference the soils, I will say we talk with the Prince George's County program administrator that works on land preservation about opportunities for MALF, knowing that they have this ability, this funding, and their biggest challenge is the soils for the qualifying criteria to meet. MALF requires at least 50% of the property to be the USDA class 1, 2, or 3 soils, those most prime and productive soils. And then there's also a woodland group, so for the woodland opportunities as well. And they have their biggest challenge is the soils qualifying criteria. And when I recently spoke with the program administrator in Prince George's County, she has said that she is having a challenge spending the county funds for available opportunities, and is working to spend the county funds before she reaches out for the state funds, is what she shared with me.
Okay, just to follow up, if I might, is there a reason why those particular soil restrictions cannot be tweaked so that the agriculture in southern Prince George's County can participate in this program. It's a lot of acreage in the state.
It is per statute, but we've been following the soil criteria qualification is written in our statute. I think it's been from the beginning of the program. We have not looked into whether it should be adjusted or not, but as anything is in statute, it is a bill change away. So what we would have to do is the research of what would make sense to have continuing trying to get the most prime and productive farms out there under easement. But is there a way to find other beneficial farms, useful farms, such as the grazing properties that might not be as much for the high quality soils, but there are successful, whether it's horse operations or other types of grazing operations that might not have the best soils, but are still a productive farm. That would be something we would have to look into and research to figure out how to do that.
I would appreciate it if you would do that because I am contemplating legislation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Delegate Lewis, do you mind if I use chair's privilege here? Because I want to expand on Delegate Healy's question, because Department of Agriculture provides tremendous technical assistance to farms. The legislature gave you, I think it was like 58 pins a few years back for those technical assistance positions. So I think one way to approach the problem Delegate Healy has highlighted is, when there are farms who are not quite meeting the 50% threshold of healthy soils, but have applied for MALF, but maybe can't meet that threshold, is there then a follow-up with technical assistance to provide greater support or funding opportunities to get those farms above that threshold? Is there a 1, 2, 3 step situation here or opportunity?
So I'll touch base on that first, and Hans, if you want to follow up, the USDA classification system of the soils, I think, is something that's done once or twice 100 years. So it's not a frequent update. It's something that the U.S. Department of Agriculture does. And I think that was done in the early 2000s across the state. Hans, I'm not sure if you know when that was done. So there isn't the classification itself wouldn't change. What we could potentially consider is if there are documentations or some type of analysis that says for this specific site, it is more productive than the standard class 1, 2, or 3, and figure out a way to document that. I'm not sure if there is. And Hans, I'm not sure if there's anything else you can add to that.
The only thing I would add, Senator Elfreth, is that when our technicians, our planners go out to farms, we write a conservation plan, we identify those resource concerns, we sit down with those landowners and farmers to explain to them what needs, what programs we have to offer to address. Quite often we get those, a lot of those landowners will accept and put those practices on the ground. We just upgraded on some of our WIP practices that get us most bang for our buck. We've gone to 100% cost share to incentivize, again, more landowners to put those practices on the ground. We can certainly, and we do, but we can certainly, MALF is a priority, so we can certainly go back out and reach out to those farmers and landowners to see, is there anything else that we can do? Why didn't this one practice get done? And then help, if it takes the ability to move that operation up, for MALF, we would certainly, we'll work with Michelle and we'll definitely make that a priority.
Thank you.
And on the technical side, there is another opportunity for landowners that don't meet the qualifying soils that they can withhold certain acres of soil. So if it's a 110-acre property and only 50 acres of qualifying soils, they can withhold 10 acres of non-qualifying soil so they can meet that 50% criteria. That works with some properties, especially, if it's 5, 10, 15 acres, when you're starting to get really big acreage that could financially impact them too much for them to be able to enter into the program. But we do try to work with them to see if there are ways to reach that criteria with potentially withheld or unpaid acres.
Thank you. Senator Gallion, and let me just point out that Senator Gallion is proudly the only sitting senator and probably the only member of the entire General Assembly who actually is a farmer. So Senator Gallion. Can't seem to hear you. Would you like to type your question in and I'll read it aloud? Okay. Okay. We're going to move on, but if you can connect, we're happy to. I am going to ask the Department of Agriculture to stay on for further conversation. Okay. Wonderful. So with that, we will move on to Department of Natural Resources and Secretary Kurtz. I've introduced Hillary Bell, who's separate from your room, but if you would like to introduce the folks who are in the room with you, I think the members would appreciate that.
Absolutely. Good morning, co-chairs, members of the Joint Committee. Thank you for having me. For the record, Josh Kurtz, Secretary at DNR. In the room with me, starting to my right, your left, Camille Williams, is Special Advisor to the Secretary. Dylan Baylor is our Legislative Director, the other side of the table. Dave Gosshorn, our Deputy Secretary, and Paul Pedito, our Assistant Secretary for Lands. And as Senator Elfreth mentioned, Hillary Bell's on the phone, who is in charge of our Land Acquisition and Planning Department. So when we talk about program open space, I think it's really important to kind of orient to the fact that when Marylanders think about the Department of Natural Resources, they think about the programs that happen on our public lands. They think about the parks, they think about the forests, and program open space really is the basis for doing that. It's the acquisition function that allows us to protect these places and then develop this programming. So wildly popular, right? Tens of millions of Marylanders are visiting these sites every year. And I think when we think, and as Secretary Addick said, when we think about this as an administration, there are several ways in which this program helps us meet the goals the governor has laid out, whether that's in climate resilience. This gives us an opportunity to really pilot the best available techniques to build resilience across the landscape. Gives us opportunity to support our rural economies. I think this is a space we could see a lot of innovation, whether that's in the outdoor recreation opportunities. As Secretary Addick, his team pointed out, innovation in the agricultural sector, looking at more opportunities for our state forests to play a role, not just in timber, but in sequestration for carbon and water protection. Really helping us think about how we restore the bay, right? Having these places that are protected in perpetuity gives us areas where we know that we're going to continue to keep nutrients on the landscape. So really excited to really dive into where we are and where we're going. Andrew, could you put the slides up, please? Thank you. I'm going to go to the next slide, please. So we're going to cover kind of the current programs and some of the challenges to these programs. And I think some of the places we're seeing some potential innovation. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all now as we're thinking about the opportunities, the challenges moving forward. We're going to then get into recent legislation, which I think really highlights some of these spaces where we can work together. And then just a couple other updates we wanted to provide to give you kind of the full picture of what's going on in the land protection program open space. Double space there. Can you please go to the next slide? All right, current programs, next slide. So when we talk about our current programs, it's important to kind of think about it in the two contexts in which we protect land. One is fee simple acquisition. This is buying, holding land. This is where our parks come from, our wildlife management areas, et cetera. When we buy these properties, we do that due diligence with the units that are going to manage it and ensure that we've got proper staffing and we have a plan and a strategy for what these properties are going to be long term. The other way that we protect land is through conservation easements. These are legal agreements with landowners to basically protect their land from development in perpetuity. Allowing for kind of the support for our rural economies, keeping forests as forests for timber production and many of the other reasons we need our forests, for keeping farms as farms, similar to the MALF program, but also giving these landowners opportunities to do things like duck hunting and creating recreational opportunities for themselves and for others. It does not require a public access piece, unlike the fee simple acquisition, but many of our conservation easements do kind of have those access provisions. Next slide, please. All right, so the big flagship program, and when you think about our state parks, all of these lands in which our families and your families go out and enjoy the land, they're protected through the program open space stateside. I'm going to run through kind of the programs and what they do, and then we'll get into the funding itself. And so one of the things we're thinking really hard about when we think about our state size is the concept of access. So we know that we've got several areas across the state where our parks are filling up on an almost daily basis. We have a physical access issue, yes. We need more park space. We need more ability for people to get into those parks. But we have several other pieces that I think are connected to access that we're really excited to tackle. trail maps, people feeling comfortable and understanding what our parks and what our other lands have to offer. I think that's an area we have a lot of growth potential, especially in our wildlife areas and with our wildlife management areas, or our forests, our state forests and wildlife management areas. Access, also transportation. How are people getting to these parks and to these resources who potentially don't have cars? Proximity to our urban centers. You know, we have a state park or state lands in almost every county with the exception of one, and that's Wacomico. So ensuring that all of our counties, all of our residents have this access. It's wild to think this, but every Marylander lives within 10 minutes of a creek or a stream or a river, but very few of those Marylanders actually have the ability to go out and experience that natural resource. So access is a really important piece of this. One other thing that I want to highlight for the committee that I think isn't often talked about when we talk about our stateside and our land holdings is the cultural resources that we manage. The Department of Natural Resources is the largest cultural resource owner in the state of Maryland, right? So just take a second and think about that. We're an agency that manage for ecological value, economic value, and social value. And a lot of that social value comes from understanding and being able to message our shared history. And that's a space I think we have a tremendous growth opportunity. I'm not going to say we don't have the proper resources now, but we have a lot of room to grow as there's a lot of stories in Maryland that we are not accurately telling. Next slide, please. So far, the stateside program has protected around 354,000 acres across the state of Maryland. And I just wanted to highlight a couple notable projects that have recently come through our pipeline. You can kind of see them there. I'm not going to get into detail because we're a little bit behind, but I just wanted you to see that they come in different sizes and scales. They represent different opportunities from the 3-acre Old South Mountain Inn property in Washington County, which is an incredible facility for us to be able to message and talk about that whole corridor, right? Whether it's the Appalachian Trail, whether it's the Civil War. I mean, so many opportunities with Old South Mountain Inn. Now, it's a small property, but it really allows us to unlock the potential of a lot of our larger properties around that. Next slide, please. Then we have the program Open Space local side, and this is an incredibly popular program, right? We work with all of our counties, with Baltimore City, to help them fund the projects that I'm sure everybody has seen and everybody enjoys, whether these are ball fields, whether these are hiking trails, ADA accessibility to our resources, picnic benches, you name it, pools. This is where program Open Space local side really comes into play. And again, this is a transfer tax funded program. As you can see at the bottom, we've done 6,900 grants and it's protected 50,000 acres. But I think the thing about local side that's so important is that it's also improving these spaces, right? It's making the state a really important partner for the counties, helping get our students and our children and all of us out into nature in ways that allow us to recreate and improve our health outcomes. So I think a very popular program as well. Next slide. Then we have the Rural Legacy Program. And this program is really unique in that it's grassroots built. So we have sponsors for Rural Legacy who work in these rural legacy areas. They work with the landowners and they provide grants to land trusts and the counties to purchase these easements that are in the designated rural legacy areas. I'm going to show you a map of that all throughout the state. And this program allows us to protect these properties and provide a financial incentive to protect these properties so that they continue to do the things that are so important for our economies, but also like as Secretary Addix pointed out, important for our water quality and for climate sequestration, carbon sequestration and resilience. So very important program as well. Next slide. And so what this map shows you is the 35 designated rural legacy areas. So what we're working with our local sponsors and doing these conservation easement purchases and acquisitions within these areas. So we're working directly with counties, local land trusts, and that partnership really allows us to find and work with farmers and timber owners, forest stand owners to ensure that we're protecting some of the best available properties, but also so that we're helping them find opportunities to improve on those properties, do restoration practices as well. The next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about the programs, but where does that come from? And it comes from the transfer tax allocation. This is done by a formula. As Michelle said, that 0.05, very important for MALF, just like the 0.15 is for open space stateside. And so you can see a lot of the programming is for open space, but all of these programs, kind of this is how the formula is broken out, and then we move forward with executing the programs themselves. Next slide. So there's several pieces of the formula that aren't really reflected in that pie chart, and we're going to be providing you all with additional detail for that formula following up here. It's substantial. We could probably have a whole discussion just on that formula alone. So wanted to stay in kind of the high level, but these are a couple of the highlights for some of the other programs, including the $10 million direct grant to Baltimore City, a wide range of different ways that we're spending these funds, and that the legislature has made statutory changes to allocate some of these funding. So we'll follow up with that detail. Next slide, please. And so now I want to get into what you see when you look at the balance sheets of program open space. The state fund right now is $183 million of unencumbered projects. 159 million of that was authorized in 23 and 24 because of extremely high transfer tax revenue. So it's really important for us to think about what the real estate market is doing and how that's driving the transfer tax, and then how that has implications for us, not only now, but in the future. So we've been sitting on a very, very hot real estate market. And when that happens, it means there's a lot of transactions. So we have a lot of money coming into the transfer tax coffers, and it makes it much more difficult for us to purchase property. Anybody who's bought a house recently knows it's listed for $500,000 and you put in your $515,000 offer and you later find out that somebody bought it for $585,000, right? We're not able to be $585,000. We've got to be 500, and based on our appraisals. So what that does, it makes it really hard in the times when we are getting the most fund to put that fund out on the street. Now, when the market cools, ensuring that we have this balance kind of continuing forward is important, because the market cools, and now we can provide a really important resource for those that want to move out of properties and want those properties to stay in conservation and provide a benefit to all Marylanders. So when we then step out of that really hot market, that's when we can kind of hit the ground running and do a lot more acquisition. That being said, our land acquisition and planning staff has, under Hillary's leadership, has really ramped up over the past 9 months, continuing to add staff. We're pretty much fully staffed at this point in time, including the 2 pins from Great Maryland Outdoors Act. And we've got $85 million encumbered, over 11,500 acres that are in the pipeline. So very, very robust pipeline now, will be even more robust once we move out of such a hot real estate market. Next slide, please. So same thing in the program open space local fund balance. It looks rather high, although we do have several projects that are encumbered. And this is in large part because of the popularity of our local parks and playgrounds infrastructure funding. 170 million has been authorized for LPPI. And I can tell you at every Board of Public Works meeting, like half of what we've got on our agenda are these projects. These are wildly popular with our county and municipal partners. Because we're putting projects on the ground quickly that improve their public parks, their recreation areas. We're also seeing that counties spend their local side at different rates, and that's due to a lot of different things, right? Staff turnover, ability to find willing landowners. So we do kind of see differences in rates of application of the projects across counties and across time. So with LPPI, kind of offsetting some of the funding, I would say we would normally put through program open space local. We have seen that fund grow. Although again, this is one where you look at the requests that are coming in and some of the long-term planning, we're looking at over $2 billion in recreation needs for our counties. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we got to that number a little bit later on. So this is where we're at on the funds. And now what I really want to touch on, and is a really critical component to how we, the department, administer these funds, is where we're at in terms of staffing. So Andrew, if you go to the next slide, please. When you look at, actually, I think, did we lose a slide? Can I skip the slide? Yeah, there we go. So what this slide represents is land acquisition over time, the total number of land that we have, and then the number of pins. So left side is pins, right side is acreage. And what you see, and that line is the total amount of managed acres. as we're adding land, we have been losing staff over time. And so, the Great Maryland Outdoors Act came around because of the recognition that we didn't have enough staff to really implement our parks. And frankly, that's happening in our forests and in our wildlife heritage areas as well. So incredibly important for us to continue to add to our acquisition and to provide these opportunities for our people, for the state. But we also then need to ensure that we've got the operating budgets that can support that. So just wanted to show you visually kind of some of the trends we've seen in staffing and also in land acquisition. Next slide, please. And then this kind of makes that same point, but as it relates to visitorship. And so what you're seeing is visitorship and trends in visitorship over time and visitation in millions. So you'll see that our visitation has grown rapidly. COVID really brought people back outside. It's a fantastic opportunity for us, an opportunity to really lean into growing our outdoor recreation economy. We've got opportunities to expand in the climbing space. We've got opportunities in the outdoor vehicle space, and we've got significant opportunities in our traditional outdoor recreational spaces, whether that's hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing, camping, et cetera. So lands are growing, visitors are growing, and staff is decreasing. So next slide, please. So this shows where we own lands and lands kind of pre-2000 and then since 2001 in red. So you'll see kind of where we've been acquiring. As you can kind of tell from this, there's a lot of opportunities to improve kind of the equity in terms of where that acquisition can happen across the state. I would also point out that the urban core between DC, Baltimore, and Cecil has some of our most popular and heavily visited locations. Actually, Frederick too, really exploding populations out there, and not nearly the land masses that you see in Garrett, Allegheny, Dorchester, Wycomico, et cetera. Many of those lands that you do see in our more rural areas, though, are lands that we acquired directly to support those rural economies, whether those are working timberlands, state forests, or just opportunities for us for wildlife management, things like that provide that economic opportunities in the rural space. So next slide, please. So we've had some recent legislation that I wanted to touch on that impacts this program. First, next slide, please, is the Green Space Equity Program. We're really excited about this to be able to provide grants for projects to preserve and create public green space in overburdened and underserved communities. And we've got our initial request in for the budget, and we're currently mapping our eligible use areas, establishing the advisory board, and really putting together the application materials for this grant. We're getting a lot of public feedback on this to make sure that not only is the project being spent in places that are overburdened and underserved, but that our processes do not exclude those communities from being able to access those funds. Next slide, please. Tree Solutions Now Act, which is really important for us in restoring on lands that we own and on private properties so that we get the benefits, whether that's reduction in heat island, carbon sequestration, and clean water. So a lot of our focus here has been in the staffing space. We've got 5 of our 10 planting specialists filled, and we've got offers out for the other 5. So we expect to be at 10 of 10 shortly. We've planted almost 500,000 trees in the first 4 planting seasons. And I think as we just continue to grow our nursery capacity, that's really been a pinch point for us. We'll be able to meet our goals and then some. We've seen also a significant influx in federal funding through the IRA for our tree planting programs. Next slide, please. The Great Maryland Outdoors Act. This really is, it says once in a generation. I think it's maybe greater than that. We have the opportunity right now to set the stage for what our parks will be, not just tomorrow, but in 25 years. And I think you can see over time, it's hard to continue to fund parks at times, but we're going to continue to see that growth as we see a growth in population and that population change where they live in the use of our public spaces. We're working really hard right now on thinking about where those 75 pins that were authorized in the bill go to ensure that we're centralizing some of our function to be more effective and putting more people out on the ground so that we continue to have and only grow our world-class park system. And then we have advisory committees on Port of Deposit and Freedman State Historic Park. Both of these have an opportunity to really play a strong role in telling that story of Maryland, and in ways that we've never done so before. So very excited about those. We also have the commission that was laid out in statute that will be putting their report out. I also will say a kudos to DLS on the choice of contractor for the study. They're doing a fantastic job, and we're really looking forward to the reports they're going to put out in December. Next slide, please. The Maryland the Beautiful Act. So Maryland the Beautiful increased our goal of conserving 30% by 2030 and 40% by 2040. We are well on the way to 30% by 2030. We're 99.5% of the way there. And so we're going to take that extra time once we get to 2030 to really set ourselves up for success for 2040. I think this is where we want to work with you all to be really creative. It's not just going to be fee simple to get us 40% of the land. Really thinking about how we can be innovative in our easements is going to be critical. So it's not just us owning, but it's protecting and providing benefits for landowners and really, frankly, growing what those benefits can be over time, so that we get more people interested in these programs. This also means working more closely with the land trust community. This bill sets up a revolving loan program, which would directly support them in their purchases and easement acquisitions, really, really critical. And then in the Smart Growth Subcabinet, DNR is chairing this, the working group on land conservation. So really appreciate the partnership with MDA and MDE and MDP as we work to put together the plan to meet the 40% by 2040. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Yeah, perfect. And so this slide, we just wanted to highlight how subscription in these programs. So Rural Legacy, every year we're averaging about 96 million in requests, and we're authorizing about 17 million in terms of projects. So this is oversubscribed, very popular, similar to MALP. There is a time lag sometimes to getting people in the programs, but we're being consistent with our follow-up. We don't think about program open space stateside and local in the same way, since it's not a competitive grant. We're really thinking about like where we're putting that. And I think that's something we're putting a finer point on. Where is this money going? Who is it supporting? How is it providing that economic benefit? When we think about stateside, we are really looking at capacity closures. That's been a big hurdle for us. People aren't able to access the lands because too many people love them and too many people want to get out there. So we need to ensure we're creating more opportunities for folks. And then in the local side, the importance of these land preservation parks and recreation plans. And that's where we found out this $2 billion number. This is where our local governments see these opportunities, $2 billion worth to increase their recreational opportunities. So next slide, please. Just a status update on those plans. Really important for us too, for our eligibility with Land and Water Conservation Fund. That's a federal fund that we can match to do land protection. It really serves as kind of that guiding light for us in working with our counties and our local partners for that long-term strategy for acquisition. We had a contractor for this. We're currently rebidding that contract. And we also want to align this with our comprehensive long-term plan for the state system. So local system, state system, running parallel track. So when we think about things like climate resilience and access, and we're making those decisions for the state and funding those decisions at the local level, that those are additive, that we're providing additional benefit in either direction as we think about those things kind of together rather than separate. And then next slide, please. And the last slide. This is a key piece of meeting our Chesapeake Bay goals in an area where we're really excited to push the limit on how we can purchase land for restoration purposes. We've got this new report out called the Comprehensive Evaluation of System Response. And one of the things it shows us is that we have these lags, and where we see opportunities to kind of combat those lags is areas where we can do significant restoration. And so we'll be looking to our land protection programs to help create those opportunities for us to do high value restoration. Also great opportunities for us to just continue to support our local partners. And that is the last slide that we have. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Secretary Kurtz and Team DNR. Do we have any technical questions for Team DNR? Senator Gallion, I think we have you back.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I had some technical difficulties earlier. I had to switch to iPad, but we're rolling now. So a couple of questions about the tree plantings. I know it's brought up at the committee level a good bit when we were passing a legislation. Where are we with the tree maintenance aspect of that? I know that was brought up a lot because we found in the past with some previous tree plantings that, you know, they're planted and they're not mowed twice a year or whatever. And then you've just got a kind of a weedy mess and, you know, there's a lot of damage to the trees and all. So how are they keeping up with the tree maintenance aspect of that?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Guy. That's a really important point and something that I think we were excited about with the new authority under Tree Solutions Now Act, which gives us the ability to fund that, explicitly fund that when we're doing these grants and these contracts. So when people are bringing these projects to us, they're funding also the upfront preparation costs, which also helps us with long-term maintenance, and then the long-term maintenance within the grant in the project. So we're seeing that happen in the project, the entirety, kind of like the package of the project delivery.
Okay, thank you. And just one other quick question. As far as the siting of where the trees are being planted, we've had some issues in my district that they're planting a lot of trees to meet different goals, and they're pretty close to like highways, and I had a local fire company a couple of weeks ago that had an issue with, you know, the visibility when they're pulling out to respond on calls and stuff. Is that taken into consideration as far as you know, safety aspects of planting the trees too close to state highways?
Yeah, thank you for raising that. That's not a concern I'd heard before. Would it be possible for us to follow up and get more information on that? I'd like to look into the decision making that went into that project and see if that was a local partner that we didn't, you know, have that full sense from, or kind of how that happened.
Sure, no problem. We'll follow up with you.
Great, thank you,
Senator. Senator, I don't see any house hands, so I'm going to go to Senator Kagan. Okay, Senator Kagan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here. This has been really informative. I have a question for Secretary Kurtz and his team, and nice to see some familiar faces at that table. Thank you all for your service. Mr. Secretary, on your maps, could you please speak to multiple languages and access for people with disabilities?
Thank you very much for that question, Senator Kagan. Oh,
sorry, got one more question also. And Secretary Addix had a wonderful map, sorry, not to pit you guys against each other, in terms of open space and preservation, all that across the state, which led to Delegate Healy's question. I wonder if you've got a similar map on tree planting locations, just to show that there's equity and distribution among the 500,000 that have been planted so far and the 4.5 million more to come.
Yep, absolutely. I'm going to do kind of in reverse order. So tree planting mapping is being done by our partners at MDE as part of the Tree Solutions Now Act. So we can get you access to that map. A big piece of that is being able for Marylanders to see where tree planting is happening and ensuring that we're doing it in an equitable way. So happy to send that along. When it comes to access, I think you've hit on two really important pieces. So one of the things that we're looking at is what are the predominant languages being spoken around our parks, and then what are places or what are ways that other park systems, and I think the National Park Service is a really good example of this. How do you create the opportunity where maybe you don't have native speakers of those languages as members of the parks to be able to converse with and support those visitors? So one of the things that we've seen with the Park Service is they have these laminated cards that they carry around, top 5 languages. I think we've discussed this before. And they're able to actually identify what language those people are speaking through the use of those cards. So something I'm really proud of the team on. I'm just going to share one that's not fully done yet. We're really excited about in Western Maryland. We're about to open up our first ever ADA compliant fishing site. I'm really excited about that. We've had a long history under Assistant Secretary Petito's leadership of putting in hunting blinds and opportunities for hunting for those that are wheelchair bound. So we are just increasing that opportunity and really appreciative of Secretary Beatty and her team with bringing funding forward for us. We've put in soft launches for kayaks in Tuckahoe, Rocky Gap, Deep Creek,
Indian Springs.
Yeah, and several other parks to ensure that people are able to access our natural resources.
Right. If I could just suggest, so my district, both Gaithersburg and Rockville, are among the very most linguistically diverse in the state and in the nation, actually. And so there's no way that you're going to have not just Spanish and Chinese and Korean and French, but Amharic and Swahili. And, you know, we just have all the languages. I wonder if there's any thought being given on these laminated sheets, Mr. Secretary, or on signage, even to have a QR code that would help folks get to something in their language. And even if not all questions could be answered, maybe just kind of an easy FAQ, the questions that our park and trail employees hear the most often, that would at least say, we see you and you are welcome here.
I think that's a really good idea. I will definitely look into that. I think the questions we get are like, where are the bathrooms? Where's the trail map, right? I think we get those questions in every park. We can find a way to make sure we can communicate with everyone.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I do want to be cognizant of time. We had 90 minutes allocated here, and we still have to hear from Department of Planning and then have a little bit more of discussion. And I would like to also end by asking folks, joint committee members, what we missed today and what you would like us to put on the agenda for our November meeting. So start thinking about that. But we'll move on to Department of Planning. And again, we have with us Jason Dubow.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. This is Jason Dubow, Manager of Resource Conservation Management Unit with the Maryland Department of Planning. I know Secretary Flora would have liked to have been here, but she's leading the first meeting of the Accessory Dwelling Unit Task Force that was established by the General Assembly earlier this year. So just want to send her regards, of course, for today. So for this first slide, and Andrew, I don't know, can you put it up? Thanks. If you go to the next slide, please. So you may well be aware of the Maryland Protected Lands dashboard that's available online. And we work closely with DNR and with MALF at MDA. And we also collect through the land preservation, parks and recreation plans, and from other sources, the best available data on all types of land conservation that are happening across the state, whether it's at the local level, state level, federal level, or at non-governmental organizations like land trusts. So we update this every quarter. It was last updated at the end of June, and we'll be updating it soon. Once this September is over, we'll get the next quarterly data from our partners for that. As you see, this makes it very easy for folks to choose either statewide or at the county level what's happening in their jurisdiction. There's filters at the top right, and then you can see for whenever you choose a particular location, it will show you, like for example here, statewide in Maryland, we have a certain amount of land protected. We protected more land since that, as you'll see in subsequent slides. This was at the end of June 30th, and now we're in September. So Andrew, next slide, please. And yeah, thanks. And so there are a couple statewide preservation goals. As you know, we've had this long-standing agricultural preservation goal, which just recently was updated to be achieved by 2030. General Assembly passed the law in 2021 to do that. And also added a few more programs, such as Maryland Environmental Trust, to that tracking effort. So you see we're about 86% of the way to that agricultural preservation goal statewide. And tracking, we try to see what the trends are the past 5 years. And we see that we're pretty close to achieving that 2030 goal at the current trend rate, although we would probably just miss it and achieve it in 2031. Other participating programs include Rural Legacy, the MALF program, and also local purchase development rights and transferable development rights programs. Next slide, please. So as Secretary Kurtz noted, we had this new law just passed, the Maryland the Beautiful Act, achieving 30% of land protection of Maryland by 2030 and 40% by 2040. As we are now, best available data, new data since the dashboard had last been updated, shows that we're very close to achieving the 2030 goal already. However, 2040 goal is much more challenging. Looking at the past 5 fiscal years, this includes everything that's tracked on the dashboard, the Maryland Protected Lands dashboard. That means that the trend rate, even though we've been doing pretty well the last 5 years, we're still looking at falling short of that 2040 goal by approximately 170,000 acres. So that's pretty much another maybe 7 years past that 2040 level, 2040 milestone. So as Secretary Kurtz noted, this Smart Growth Subcabinet led by Secretary Flora and having Secretary Kurtz and Secretary Addix and others helping us with this, figuring out how can we make progress and achieve this 2040 by 40% for 2040 goal. So I just want to give you the update, and we're glad to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you to Department of Planning. We appreciate it. And I, until we organized this, I didn't realize that that tool was available. I'm going to ask Allie from my team to try to hopefully find the link and drop it in the chat so committee members can tool around with that as needed. Chair Lewis.
Thank you, Chair Alfreth, and thank you, Mr. Dubo, for the presentation. Thanks also to Secretary Kurtz and his team for their awesome presentation. A question for you, Mr. Dubo. I love the dashboard. When you measure and report on tree planting, very curious, are you able to document or to track canopy or geographic surface area coverage, as well as the simple count? Because one of the things we know about tree planting, it's not just the number of trees that go in, but the environmental services they offer are based on canopy or coverage.
Absolutely. And that's actually one category that we do not track in the preservation categories at this time. That maybe we need to be thinking about how to integrate that together. I think Secretary Kurtz noted that maybe through the MDE approach that they've been using, they may have that data, but we can certainly follow up. I don't know if Secretary Kurtz or if you know the answer to that.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Jason. And we there's a couple tools here, I think, to look at canopy. One is the recent Harry Hughes technical study on forests. That's a very fine scale data set that looks at tree canopy and forest cover, and is important and is I think publicly available right now. So I think there are data sets for that. I believe right now that our tracking is more focused on the number of trees, the project locations, but we do have additional data sets and layers that we can look at to see that coverage that as you noted, is so important for us in thinking about how we move forward with plantings.
Thank you. I'd love to follow up on that. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
We have a delegate's hand up as well.
Yes, Delegate Hilly.
Thank you very much, very, very much. I was curious about the tree planting and how and if you coordinate with State Highway, because they plant trees all over the place in median strips and so forth. Are you involved in that? Do you help them with maintenance or any other things that are involved with that?
Yeah, State Highways is a critical partner for us, especially because of the amount of tree plantings that they do and the mitigation projects that they do. I think the great thing about the Tree Solutions Now Act is it really gave us a mechanism to coordinate. I think as Senator Gallion pointed out, maybe we could be a little better at that. But I do think that that's really been a focus here. Is it's not just with State Highways, but with our nonprofit partners, with our academic institutions, ensuring that we really have a good handle on the number of trees that are being planted in the state of Maryland, what that's doing for demand in our nurseries, how the state nursery can be a part of that. So there's a lot of moving pieces here that I think that the Tree Solutions Now Act has had us bring together so that we really have a better understanding.
And are you, if I just follow up, are you working with them to maintain the trees that are planted? Because that is a critical piece. Are you is anybody keeping track of the loss of how many trees that are planted are lost in the first few years because there's not enough water or whatever happens to them?
Yeah, and one of the things we're looking at is the effectiveness of our planting, right? The densities of our plantings, the species that we're planting, where those species are going in to ensure, again, that we're learning and continuing to be able to improve on those plantings. We do have, whether it's on state land through our Forest Service, the ability to work with partners and on state lands to do our own tree maintenance and management as well. I think it's been pointed out here multiple times is really the crux of being successful at tree planting is that long-term approach. It's not just drop them in the ground and hope it rains enough. And so that's one of the things that we've been really focused on. And again, that coordination is the reason we're able to do that effectively. We're also seeing in certain jurisdictions that they've got kind of like volunteer engagement opportunities, right? Where people are coming out and doing some of this maintenance. So again, it really comes back to being a centralized, well-coordinated unit with MDA and MDE and planning to be able to do this.
And are you tracking it? That's my main question is, are you keeping the data to see how long these trees live? We've planted 5 million trees and half of them die in a year or 3.
Part of the staffing up.
Yep. It's part of what we're tracking. It's part of the grant deliverables. When we're funding those plantings on private properties or with other entities, we track that ourselves too for any of the plantings that we're doing on state land to ensure that we're optimizing those and making sure that we don't then see, invasive species kind of come in behind it. That early successional forest is highly susceptible to those invasive species. So it's something we really need to stay on top of so that we're not kind of creating corridors for those to move into private properties, impact our farmers, things like that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Delegate. So I think these are perfect segues into the question I posed about 10 minutes ago. When Delegate Lewis and I had one-on-ones with the departments over the summertime, trying to think about what direction we wanted to take this initial briefing, certainly getting updates on critical legislation many of the members in this joint committee worked to pass over the last few years and how that overlays and impacts the programs we're here to discuss. But also emerging trends. And I think we've heard a lot of that. And to the departments, I think what you've heard from the joint committee is a lot of focus on trees. I have an obvious bias here. And if Delegate Stein were able to make it today, he and I serve on the Chesapeake Bay Commission. So we are laser focused on outcomes we all have, the Bay States have for 2025 and beyond. And one of the outcomes that we are just across the Bay, not just Maryland, but across the Bay, just not doing a great job on. And Secretary Addix knows where I'm going with this, but it's maybe a place where all these come together, which is forest buffers. And I think the conversation we've had here is we should maybe think about a little more focus on our resources and our efforts in the places that are going to have the greatest return for air quality improvements, water quality improvements, quality of life improvements, and things like that. So I would pose perhaps when we come back in November, we can have more focus on trees, and Secretary Addix is okay to maybe dig in a little bit on forest buffers and that the relationship. Hans touched on it a little bit, but the relationship with MALF, I think would be a really healthy discussion for us to have.
Of course.
Those are my ideas, but I open it up to the joint committee. Other things that you would like us to discuss and start thinking about before January.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Something your summary really tied everything up in a nice package where we should be focusing. I agree with you that we have an amazing opportunity with the great leadership at these agencies and our governor focused on environment, climate, and justice. We have a great opportunity to achieve some significant outcomes. So that's a terrific organizing concept for us. I'm also wondering, to build on that, I'm wondering if our next meeting can include attention to the disparity between areas of high population and low preservation. When we looked at the map from the Department of Agriculture, we saw the distribution of protected lands. And I think it was the secretary himself who noted that Central Maryland, which is an area of high population, also has really high demand for open space. I think Secretary Kurtz mentioned it as well. and both secretaries talked about access. So if the places where people live and where demand is really high are also the same places with low access, maybe there's some opportunities there. I agree with the senator that we should be focusing on outcomes. But one of the outcomes in terms of resilience and health and justice is connecting people to outdoor opportunities. Something else that came up for me, if I may, was the trend, the staffing trends. And we've got these amazing goals. And according to Secretary Kurtz's analysis, increased land acquisition and increased demand, but the staffing trends aren't matching. So I'm just wondering if we could focus on that a little bit as well. I realize you're staffing up and all that, but can we go more quickly? How can we address that so we meet our goals and outcomes? Thank you.
Delegate, those are excellent points of conversation for our next conversation. I see Team DNR is giving us a thumbs up. Thank you. Joint committee members, don't feel like you have to give us something now. You can think about it and email the delegate or I with ideas or things that you want to discuss at our November 1st meeting. But we have a couple of points that I think are really relevant, and our goal was to try to tie everything together and look at it holistically instead of siloed, which is I think what we often tend to do in government across the board. I do want to point out to the Joint Committee that Allie just emailed you the dashboard from Department of Planning. So I encourage you to think through that, and just like Delegate Healy did, think about how these programs are impacting your districts, your counties, and how we can frankly just do better, as Delegate Lewis said. So, seeing no further hands or other suggestions, Delegate Lewis, you want to take us home?
I'd love to. Thank you so much, Senator Elfreth, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you to Secretary Addix, Secretary Kurtz, Mr. Dubo, representing the Department of Planning, and Secretary of Planning, and all of our amazing, thoughtful, and engaged committee members. We will gather again, and I look forward to spending the next few years making sure that we align our vision for a healthy, sustainable, and just Maryland with our outcomes. I believe we can do it, and we have the expertise and the will. So thanks again, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you, and thank you to DLS staff. Appreciate you.
Always.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.